Welcome to Reflections, a program that turns back the pages of history, revealing the lives of heroes of faith from the past. And now our host, Jonathan Griffin.
Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the Higher Grounds podcast and today's episode of Reflections. Glad you tuned in today, and it's a real pleasure to have you all on the podcast here. And today, we're going to be talking about a very special event here on the podcast. We usually talk about, certain individuals from history and all great Christians from the days of old. But today, we're going to be talking about more of a movement of God in times of old. It had some very key figures in it, and so it's going to be a little bit of a different episode today. And this is hopefully going to be the first of a two-part series we're doing on this movement. But today, we're going to be talking about what was known as the Lewis Revival of 1949. Very great move of God, and if you've never heard about it, I think you're going to greatly enjoy it. And just a little backstory to it, as I've already said, the Lewis Revival began in 1949 on one of the several small clumps of islands off the coast of Scotland, and known as the Hebrides Islands, and those islands are still there today. And this Lewis Revival specifically took place on, of course, the Isle of Lewis. And so this was a very, very interesting movement of God. I think you're going to enjoy hearing about it. And so we'll just hop right on in here and begin talking about it today. As I've already said, this is a very interesting movement of God, and you'll understand what I mean by that later. But, while this revival, it was different than some of the great movements of God in the past, while other great movements of God were led by a single figure, the revival was somewhat led by a single figure, I guess you could say. But behind the scenes and working in and among that revival were many, many key figures that God used in that movement, men and women and even young people who God greatly used to further that movement. And the history of the island, too, the Isle of Lewis, is a very interesting history. You see, before the Great Revival, as they called it, of 1949, the Lewis Revival, the Isle of Lewis had experienced many great and true movements of God, even revivals, and had seen many souls saved in time past and people set on fire for God. But as time goes on, and as it often happens, the old saints who had seen such great movements died out, and a new generation came up, as the Bible says, that knew not the things of God. And so the natives of the Isle of Lewis said that before the Great Revival of 1949 took place, that the island was in a state of spiritual coldness, with the very vast majority of young people caring nothing about God. And that was one of the great burdens of the Lewis Revival, was the young people, because the young people had strayed so far away. And they cared nothing about the things of God. And the churches, some of them were down to an attendance of just the pastor and maybe two or three people. So in other words, sometimes it was just the pastor and his family that attended church. It got that bad in most places. And they even went so far as to put out a public petition to the island in the newspaper. The church did, all of the churches, that they would pray and that they'd seek God to help them in this matter of the state of spiritual coldness on the island. But in the midst of all this great darkness and these hard times, there were still some lights shining for God on this island. And two of these lights were Miss Peggy and Miss Christine Smith. Miss Peggy and Miss Christine, we'll talk more about them. You'll find out more about them here as we do this series. But they were very, very great Christians, great prayer warriors, I'll say, and loved the Lord with all their heart. And they were very old. Miss Peggy was 84. Miss Christine was 82. And they lived in the town of Barvis on the Isle of Lewis. And Miss Peggy, bless her heart, she was blind, and Miss Christine was nearly bent in half with arthritis. But as I said, they were both great prayer warriors. They didn't let their condition stop them from praying. And they were always longing, especially during these times of coldness, they were longing to see God do a great and mighty work on the island, especially among the young people. And so one night, as they were praying, Miss Peggy told her sister that she had received a vision from God. Now, whether it was a real vision or not, I don't know. I'm just reciting the history here. But she said she saw the church of her fathers crowded with young people and a strange minister in the pulpit. And this vision, she said she had received from God, so impressed her that she called the local minister, who was a great man, a God-fearing man, and one who he loved his church, he loved his island dearly, and he had done everything he knew to help his people, but nothing seemed to work. And the man's name was Reverend James Murray Mackay. And Miss Peggy called him, and being the faithful man he was, he, as soon as he could, he got down there to Miss Peggy and Miss Christine's house. And when he arrived, Miss Peggy began to reveal her vision to Mr. Mackay. And then she said this to him and asked him this question. She said, "I am sure, Mr. Mackay, that you're longing to see God working. What about calling your office bearers together and suggest to them that you spend 2 nights a week waiting upon God? As you have tried missions, you have tried special evangelist. Mr. Mackay, have you tried God?" And so Reverend Mackay, being the man he was, immediately agreed and decided that he and his deacons and office bearers and his men would meet on Tuesday and Friday night each week and spend all night asking for God to move in the island. And Miss Peggy and Miss Christine, too, they also agreed to spend no less than 6 hours every Tuesday and Friday night in prayer for the revival. And so, as we see, as does any great movement of God, that the Lewis Revival of 1949 was birthed in the prayer closet just by a few simple people, but who love God and want to see Him work. And that's really, if you look at any great revival or movement of God, as I've already said, it always starts with somebody who wants to see God move. It may not be a lot of them, but there's maybe just one person who wants to see God move, and they pray for that to happen. They do it faithfully, and God will honor that. And so they prayed for several months in this way. Mr. Mackay and his men, Miss Peggy, Miss Christine, they all prayed for several months every Tuesday and Friday night. And all the while, they were clinging to the promises they found in the Bible, holding on to them and asking God to hold to His word that He had given them in the Bible. And one day, as they were going about their normal prayer time every Tuesday and Friday night, something wonderful happened. It was the beginning of the revival, many have said. And what happened was the men were having their usual prayer meeting in one of the local farmers' barns. And while they were kneeling down in the straw, praying and pouring their hearts out to God, one young man rose to his knees, looked at all the dear men, and then read from his Bible, Psalms chapter 24, verse 3 through 5. I'll read it for you. It says, "Who shall ascend into the hill of the Lord, or who shall stand in His holy place? He that hath clean hands and a pure heart, who hath not lifted up his soul unto vanity, nor sworn deceitfully, he shall receive the blessing from the Lord, and righteousness from the God of his salvation." And after reading this young man looked at the others still on their knees and said to them, "Brethren, it seems to me just so wrong to be praying like we are praying and waiting like we are waiting if we are not rightly related to God." And basically what I said was, it is wrong for us to pray like we are doing. It's wrong for us to wait for God to work like we are waiting if we are not on good terms with God, if we are regarding sin in our heart. And so after saying this and reading this passage of scriptures, he began to pray right there, standing in the midst of the others. He said, "God, are my hands clean? Is my heart pure?" And he got no farther than that. He fell on his face before God, began weeping and crying. And within a few minutes, 3 of those elders in the group had gone into a very deep state of prayer and meditation. And it is historically recorded, not recorded in the church, just the church records. I mean, this was historically recorded fact. It happened that the very moment that this happened in the barn, that there was a power let loose on Lewis that shook the entire island like an earthquake, but it was not an earthquake. Now, as the men said, it was God stepping down upon the island. And from that point on, the Lewis revival began, and the entire town from that point on is very amazing that the entire town had a deep and a very convicting awareness of sin and of God. And the men said the next day as they walked around to do their normal tasks in the town, they said God was everywhere. He said you could see it on the face of the people and the way they talked, the way they acted. Everything had changed on the entire island. And soon the awareness of God and sin became so great to the people on that island that work completely stopped in some of the towns, especially in Barvis where it happened. And very soon enough, the people began gathering in groups in meadows and in houses and anywhere, wherever they could, so they could talk about this strange and newfound awareness of God. And this is amazing as it is. I mean, this is incredible feat in itself. But what made this really so amazing and incredible was the fact that the vast majority of these people were not church-going people. As a matter of fact, most of these people never thought about God once in their life. These were some of the wickedest people on the island. Yet every one of them now had an awareness of God, an awareness they had sinned against God, and for the first time in their life, they were worried about where they were going to spend eternity. They hadn't heard it preached on, the vast majority of them. They didn't go to Sunday school all their lives as children. They didn't come to church every Sunday and Wednesday. But God put it in their hearts that He was real, that they had sinned, and that they were under conviction that they needed to be saved. Now, there have been people that argue down through the year it was just a coincidence, it was an earthquake, it scared the people into having this. But this is no coincidence. This cannot happen just because of an earthquake. This was a movement of God to put this in the people's hearts, to convict them and show them they need to be saved. And this was really how the revival started. In the prayer closet, after the prayer warriors faithfully prayed, God moved down upon the island, began to convict the people, and this made the setting perfect for the following revival. And, this was just the beginning. As I said, this was part 1 of 2. It was a little short today, I know, but next week, hopefully, we're going to do part 2 of this. I don't know. We might not have part 3, who knows, but probably just going to do part 2. And I'm looking forward to talk some more about the Lewis Revival. And I hope you greatly enjoyed it today, my friends. And remember, my friends, keep pressing on the upward way.